William thought the lawyers were checking a routine property agreement. Then they found one clause buried deep inside the paperwork. A clause that appeared to give members of Camilla's family rights over a royal residence far beyond what William believed had ever been intended. Within this dramatized royal scenario, William gave one immediate order: freeze the arrangement. But when Camilla discovered what that meant for her family, she didn't call William. She went straight to Charles. Before we reveal what the lawyers discovered, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, which city are you watching from? William wasn't investigating Camilla's family. He wasn't even looking for a problem. Within this dramatized royal scenario, the meeting was supposed to be routine, a review of crown property arrangements that could eventually carry into William's reign. Residence after residence appeared on the list: staff housing, official apartments, properties occupied under temporary agreements. Then one lawyer stopped turning pages. There's something unusual here. William looked up. The property was connected to members of Camilla's family. Nothing about that initially concerned him. Charles had apparently allowed the residence to be used under an established family arrangement. William asked the obvious question: when does the agreement end? The lawyer didn't answer. Instead, he reread one paragraph. William leaned forward. What? The occupants weren't described simply as temporary residents. Buried inside the legal wording was a phrase suggesting continuing residential rights. William frowned. Continuing until when? Silence. A junior lawyer searched through the supporting documents. Another checked the original authorization. Still no clear answer. Then the senior lawyer turned another page. The language became even stranger. Certain rights appeared capable of continuing after the circumstances that had originally justified the arrangement had changed. William immediately understood the implication. What happens after my father's reign? Nobody wanted to answer too quickly. Finally, the senior lawyer said, "That is precisely what we need to establish." William closed the other property files. The routine meeting was over. He wanted the complete history of the residence. Who owned it? Who authorized its use? Whether anyone had ever approved permanent occupation. And most importantly, whether a future sovereign could recover it. Then the lawyer found another clause. He read it silently. His expression changed. William noticed. What does it say? The lawyer turned the document toward him. Because suddenly the problem wasn't that Camilla's family lived in the house today. It was that someone may have written the agreement so they could still claim the right to live there tomorrow. William didn't accuse anyone. He didn't call Camilla. And he certainly didn't order her family out of the house. Within this dramatized royal scenario, he gave the lawyers one instruction: freeze the arrangement. No extension, no transfer, no amendment. Nothing changed until they could establish exactly what rights had been created. William wanted answers before action. The lawyers went back through years of paperwork. At first, the arrangement appeared straightforward. Charles had approved use of the residence. Members of Camilla's family had been allowed to live there. But then the legal team found something William hadn't expected. The right to occupy the property didn't appear tied to one simple date. It was connected to a series of conditions. And under one interpretation, those conditions could survive even after the circumstances that created the arrangement had ended. William leaned forward. You mean after my father's reign? The senior lawyer chose his words carefully. Potentially, that one word changed the room. William wasn't concerned that Camilla's family had somewhere to live. He was concerned that a private arrangement created under Charles might become an obligation imposed on the next sovereign. So he asked the next question. Who approved this wording? The lawyers searched the authorization pages. There was documentation from Charles's reign. There were palace references. There were administrative approvals. But the strongest version of the residential protection did not carry the clear authorization William expected. Then one lawyer noticed the date. The controversial wording had been added after the original residence agreement. William stared at it. So this wasn't part of the first arrangement? No. Before William could ask who had added it, an advisor entered. A formal notice had already been issued informing the affected household that the property agreement was under legal review. William's expression changed. Who received it? The advisor hesitated. The Queen. Across the palace, Camilla was reading the letter, and she wasn't seeing a legal freeze. She was seeing something much more personal. William was coming for her family's home. Camilla didn't wait for William to explain. Within this dramatized royal scenario, she read the legal notice twice, placed it on the table, and went straight to Charles. William is trying to take their home. Charles looked up. What? Camilla pushed the letter toward him. The wording was formal. Property review. Temporary freeze. Residential rights under examination. But Camilla wasn't interested in legal language. Her family had lived under an arrangement she believed Charles had already settled. Now William's lawyers were questioning whether that arrangement should continue. Charles initially dismissed it as an administrative review. Then he reached the second page. His expression changed. The lawyers weren't simply checking who currently occupied the residence. They were questioning whether those occupants had been granted rights that could survive far beyond the original agreement. Camilla became defensive. They were given a home. Charles kept reading. This says something different. The distinction was uncomfortable. Allowing someone to live in a royal residence was one thing. Creating a legal expectation that they could remain there indefinitely, even after the circumstances surrounding that permission changed, was something else. Camilla stared at him. You agree with William? I haven't said that. Charles turned another page. Then he found the clause William's lawyers had highlighted. Continuing residential rights. Possible protections against termination. Language apparently added after the original arrangement. Charles stopped. Camilla noticed immediately. What? Charles looked directly at her. Did you know this was here? Camilla took the document. She read the clause. Once. Then again. Her anger disappeared. I've never seen this. Charles studied her face. You never asked for it? No. That answer created a completely different problem. If Camilla hadn't requested permanent protection, and Charles believed he had only approved use of the residence, who had strengthened the agreement? Charles stood and picked up the legal file. I'm speaking to William. Camilla expected him to defend her family. But before leaving, Charles asked one question she wasn't prepared for. Camilla, did anyone ever tell you this house would eventually become theirs? Charles arrived with the property file in his hand. Within this dramatized royal scenario, he didn't ask William for an explanation. He placed the document directly on the table. Why are you threatening Camilla's family with losing their home? William remained calm. I'm not. Charles pointed toward the legal notice. Then what do you call this? William brought in the palace lawyers. The senior lawyer opened the original property agreement and turned to the authorization page. There it was. Charles's name. Camilla, who had followed him into the meeting, immediately noticed. You approved it. For a moment, that appeared to settle everything. Charles had authorized the residence. Camilla's family had moved in under that authority. William had no hidden scandal to uncover. Then Charles began reading. His expression slowly changed. I approved them living there. William said nothing. Charles turned another page. Then another. I never approved this. He pointed toward the clause granting continuing residential rights. The room fell silent. The lawyer placed two versions of the agreement side by side. The first was the document Charles remembered. Permission to occupy the property under defined circumstances. The second contained something stronger. Additional protections, different termination language, and wording that could make recovering the residence far more difficult. Charles looked toward Camilla. She appeared equally confused. When was this added? The senior lawyer checked the records. 11 months after Charles's original approval. William leaned forward. So my father authorized the residence. The lawyer nodded, but not necessarily the later protections. Another nod. Camilla's anger turned into concern. If Charles hadn't requested the change, and she hadn't requested it either, somebody else had apparently decided her family needed stronger legal protection. Then the lawyer opened the amendment history. There was no obvious royal signature. Instead, one reference number appeared beside the change. The senior lawyer recognized it. His face tightened. William noticed. What is that? The lawyer pulled another file from the stack. Because the controversial clause hadn't appeared by accident. Someone had specifically requested that it be added after Charles signed the original agreement. The lawyer placed the amendment beside Charles's original agreement. The difference looked small. Legally, it was enormous. Within this dramatized royal scenario, Charles had approved Camilla's family using the residence under defined conditions. But 11 months later, new language had appeared. Language Charles said he had never authorized. William leaned closer. What exactly changed? The senior lawyer pointed to one paragraph. The original agreement allowed the Crown to reconsider occupation when circumstances changed. The amendment made that far more difficult. It introduced protections suggesting the occupants could retain residential rights even after the original reason for granting them the property no longer existed. Charles stared at the page. After my reign? Potentially, the lawyer replied. Camilla immediately pushed back. My family didn't write this. William looked at her. Then somebody wrote it for them. That was the problem. Nobody was accusing Camilla's family of stealing a house. Nobody was claiming they had secretly purchased royal property. But someone appeared to have strengthened their position without clearly establishing whether Charles intended that protection to survive him. William asked the question everyone was avoiding. If I became king tomorrow, could I simply recover the property? The lawyer hesitated, not without potentially challenging this clause. William sat back. Now he understood why the review mattered. A private family arrangement had potentially become a legal obstacle for the future crown. Camilla looked toward Charles. I never asked for that. Charles believed her. Then Anne, who had been silently examining the amendment, noticed a tiny reference printed beneath the controversial paragraph. What's this? The lawyers checked. It pointed to a separate supporting document, one that wasn't included in the main property file. William immediately asked for it. Minutes later, another folder arrived. And opened it first. Her expression changed, because the hidden clause hadn't been created without explanation. There was another document describing why Camilla's family needed long-term protection, and according to its wording, Charles himself may have unknowingly started the chain of events that created it, and read the second document slowly. Then she looked at Charles. Within this dramatized royal scenario, the paperwork didn't prove that Charles had secretly given Camilla's family permanent ownership of the residence. It revealed something more complicated. Years earlier, Charles had requested long-term stability for them. Not ownership, not inheritance, stability. Charles remembered the conversation. He had wanted to ensure that people close to Camilla wouldn't suddenly lose their home because of a change inside the royal household. Camilla looked relieved. There, that's what this was. But William wasn't convinced. He pointed toward the wording. This explains why they were protected. It doesn't explain why that protection became permanent. The senior lawyer agreed. Charles's original instruction appeared to support continued residence. But somewhere between that instruction and the later amendment, two very different ideas had become blurred. The right to live somewhere, and the right to prevent the owner from taking it back. Camilla immediately understood the difference. So they don't own the house? The lawyer shook his head. Not according to what we've seen. Charles leaned forward. But can they remain there? A pause. Potentially. William looked frustrated. That was exactly the legal uncertainty he wanted removed. Camilla, however, saw an opening. If her family had legitimate residential protection, William couldn't simply treat them as though they had no rights at all. She pushed the document toward him. You want a proof? There it is. William shook his head. No, this proves my father wanted them protected. Then he pointed toward the amended clause. It doesn't prove he intended to give away control of the property. Silence. And close the file. The supposed scandal had now flipped. Nobody had necessarily stolen anything. Nobody had necessarily acted secretly. The real problem was that years of paperwork had transformed a promise of security into something dangerously close to a permanent entitlement. William turned toward the senior lawyer. One question. The lawyer waited. William tapped the property file. Forget who lives there. Who actually owns the house? The lawyer didn't answer immediately, and judging by his expression, the answer was about to change the entire argument again. The lawyer didn't answer William immediately. Instead, he requested the original property register. Within this dramatized royal scenario, everyone had spent hours arguing over who had the right to live in the residence. Nobody had yet answered who actually owned it. The file arrived. The senior lawyer opened it. Camilla leaned forward. Charles remained silent. William asked again, "Who owns the house?" The lawyer traced the property's history. It had never been transferred outright to Camilla. It had never been transferred to her children. And despite Charles approving their residence, there was no document showing that he had personally gifted them ownership. Camilla frowned. "Then Charles owns it?" The lawyer shook his head. That surprised everyone. The property remained connected to a structure under Crown control. Charles could authorize its use during his reign. He could allow someone to make it their home. But permanently removing it from future royal control was a different legal question. William immediately understood. So my father could give them permission to live there? Yes, but he didn't necessarily give them the house. Correct. Camilla went silent. For years, her family had treated the residence as home. And emotionally it was, legally, that was becoming much harder to define. Charles looked toward William. "You're not throwing them out because of a technicality." William shook his head. "This isn't a technicality." He pointed toward the amended agreement. "If this clause survives indefinitely, then someone has effectively restricted what the Crown can do with property it still owns." Camilla stood. "What are you going to do?" William looked toward the lawyers, then gave the instruction she had feared from the beginning. "Terminate the disputed arrangement." Camilla's face changed. Charles immediately objected, but William wasn't finished. Nobody would be removed tomorrow. There would be a transition period. A lawful replacement could be considered. But the old agreement, the one containing the hidden protection, was finished. Camilla stared at him, because William had just separated two things her family had believed were the same. Having a home there, and having a right to keep it forever. Camilla stared at William. Terminate it? Within this dramatized royal scenario, those two words sounded exactly like what she had feared from the beginning. Her family was losing their home. Charles immediately intervened. "You cannot simply put them out." William turned toward him. "I'm not." That distinction mattered. The lawyers explained that William's instruction did not mean Camilla's family would be forced from the residence immediately. There would be time, a transition period, and, if legally appropriate, a new temporary arrangement could be created. But one thing would disappear: the disputed continuing entitlement. The old agreement would no longer be allowed to create an indefinite claim over property that remained under Crown control. Camilla wasn't satisfied. "You're taking away the only certainty they have." William shook his head. "I'm taking away a guarantee nobody can prove was properly granted." Charles looked at the lawyers. None contradicted him. That silence hurt Camilla more than William's words. For years, the residence had simply been home. Now, it had become clauses, authorizations, ownership records, and termination rights. Camilla walked toward the window. Then she turned back. What if the Crown isn't responsible for their future? William frowned. Camilla continued. "What if I am?" The room went quiet. She proposed something nobody expected. If her family needed permanent security, perhaps it should no longer depend on a royal residence at all. She could use private resources to help establish another home. One nobody could review when the monarch changed. Charles looked stunned. William said nothing. Camilla had spent the entire confrontation fighting to preserve her family's position. Now, she was offering to separate them from the Crown herself. But there was a condition. She looked directly at William. "If I give up any permanent claim to this residence." She paused. "How long will you give them to leave?" William looked toward the lawyers, then gave an answer Camilla never expected. William didn't answer immediately. Camilla had just offered something nobody expected. Within this dramatized royal scenario, she was prepared to surrender any permanent claim her family might have to the residence. But she wanted one thing in return. Time. Don't make them leave as though they've done something wrong. William looked toward the lawyers. The senior lawyer explained that nothing required an immediate departure. The disputed clause could be terminated while allowing a reasonable transition period. William turned back to Camilla. 12 months. Camilla stared at him. She had expected weeks, perhaps a few months, not a full year. Charles looked equally surprised. William continued. During that period, Camilla's family could remain in the residence under a clearly temporary agreement. Non permanent entitlement. no inheritance rights, no suggestion that the property belonged to them. But nobody would be abruptly displaced either. Camilla's expression softened. Then she made her offer official. She would help her family establish a genuinely private residence using private resources. A home that didn't depend on Charles remaining king. A home William couldn't review when his reign began. And a home no palace lawyer could later describe as crown property. Charles finally understood what she was doing. Camilla wasn't surrendering her family's security. She was separating that security from royal privilege. William nodded. Then I'll agree to the transition. But he added one more condition. Before the family left, the entire residence would be inventoried. Anything belonging privately to them could go. Anything belonging to the crown would remain. Camilla agreed. The confrontation appeared finished. Then the senior lawyer interrupted. There's one more thing. Everyone turned. He had been reviewing the original acquisition records, and buried inside them was a restriction nobody had noticed earlier. William leaned forward. What restriction? The lawyer placed the oldest document on the table. Because the house wasn't merely crown control property. Its original terms apparently limited who could ever receive permanent ownership of it. Camilla stared at the page. Charles went silent. And suddenly, William's decision wasn't just defensible. The lawyers had found evidence that permanently giving the house to Camilla's family may never have been legally available in the first place. The oldest document changed the room. Within this dramatized royal scenario, the lawyers had finally reached the paperwork nobody had thought to examine at the beginning. The original property terms. And buried inside them was the restriction that explained everything. The residence could be used by members of the royal family and by individuals authorized under crown arrangements. But permanent ownership could not simply pass to an outside private family through an ordinary residential agreement. Camilla read the clause herself, then looked at Charles. So you couldn't have given them the house? The senior lawyer answered carefully, not in the way the later paperwork appeared to suggest. Charles sat back. For years, he had believed he was providing stability. Camilla's family believed they had a secure home. And somewhere along the way, legal wording had blurred permission to live there with something dangerously close to a permanent right to keep it. William hadn't created that problem. He had inherited it. Camilla looked toward him. You knew. No. William pointed toward the lawyers. They found it. That mattered. This wasn't William searching for an excuse to remove Camilla's family. A routine review had uncovered an arrangement that could eventually collide with the crown's ownership rights. William confirmed the 12-month transition. Nobody would be suddenly evicted. Camilla would help establish a genuinely private home for her family, and everything personally belonging to them would leave with them. But the royal residence itself would return to clear crown control. Charles finally nodded, not happily, but knowingly. The lawyers closed the file. The mystery was over. And the truth was far less simple than William taking Camilla's family's home. Because legally, the question had never really been whether they loved the house, whether they had lived there for years, or whether Charles wanted them protected. The question was whether anyone had possessed the authority to promise it permanently. And after hours of documents, amendments, and hidden clauses, the answer finally emerged. A royal residence could become their home. But that never necessarily meant it could become theirs.